Hello, everybody. Today we begin our reading on St. Augustine. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to give you some context. I'll give you a little heads up on what happens in this book and why we're reading it. And I'll also give you a little sort of compare and contrast to some of the other philosophers we've read. And that'll help set the tone for what is going to happen for these next few classes. So, Augustine is Saint Augustine, which means he was a bishop actually. So, his philosophy is going to be a Christian philosophy, and most specifically, he's Catholic, and yet he is one of the intellectual pillars of the Christian church in general. So even if you're not Catholic, if you're some kind of Christian, you should be able to see some of the theory behind your religion. But here's already something I want to point out. Augustine was a bishop, and he had official religious duties. That was part of his life. But Augustine was also a philosopher. So what you'll notice is that in this reading, if we drop the saint from his name and the occasional references to God, which we get some of those references in the first few chapters of the first book, and then the third book is much more about God. But my point here is that if you set those things aside, just as if you sort of bracket some of the references to God and Descartes, what you get is just philosophy. And by philosophy, even though there's many varieties of philosophy, philosophy always tries to make claims, tries to say that certain things are true, and then always tries to back up that claim with some reason why, with some form of proof, with some sort of logic. Now, if Augustine does that well, which he does, if he philosophizes well, he gives good reasons, he gives logical argument and proof for what he says, then whether you're Christian, atheist, agnostic, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, right, all these things, then the logic of it still makes sense. So using an example that we'll get to later in Augustine, if you're Christian or atheist or agnostic, etc., 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 math still works the same. If you're Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish and you get in a car wreck, right, the world is exactly the same no matter what your religion is. So I want you to do two things at once with Augustine. They'll seem like opposites, but they're not. Note that he's Christian, and note the Christian themes and influence in his writing. And if you're Christian, sort of bring that stuff home for you. There's reasons for my beliefs. They're not just randomly held opinions, but there's logic and reason behind it. And if you're not Christian, then at least know now you're learning something more about another belief system. Okay, so that's one thing I want you to do. Notice the Christianity of it. Notice how there are claims being made about God that are backed up, that are specifically to the Christian God. And if you're Christian, okay, you learn something more about your own beliefs. If you're not, then you learn something else about this other religion, very large, etc., religion that you know something about it. Here's the other thing I want you to do. Sort of ignore the fact that he's Christian too. Because most of what he does in books 1 and 2, not so much in book 3, but in books 1 and 2, is philosophy. And part of philosophy is logic. Right? If you say all of one kind of object are the same kind of other object, so all trees are plants. So if you said all T are P, all trees are plants. And then if I say to you, well, this oak is a tree, then everyone with half a brain to do logic automatically knows that the oak is also a plant. Because if an oak is a kind of tree, and all trees, every single kind of tree, is a plant, then any new kind of tree you come across, you know it's a plant. Now, I know that doesn't seem too useful, but neither does saying that 2 and 2 is 4 seem useful in the abstract. The point is that certain logical claims, and these are the things that I try to have you outline in your papers, and the things that I try to point out to you are the reasons, the proof given by each philosopher we read. Those are the things that float independent of religion. They float independent of time and place. In the same way that 2 and 2 equaled 4 for the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, all these people, and they equal 2 and 2 equal 4 today for you and I. And Augustine, he's sort of in the middle. He's like 400 AD is when he was alive. 2 and 2 is 4 for all of us. So, you see how it seems opposed, but it's not exactly? You want to note the Christianity of it because that's part of what Augustine's about. But you also want to notice that philosophy is independent of time, place, religion, personal opinion. There's something, maybe not all of it, but there's something in each philosophy that does its work metaphorically like math does. And the Jewish person does math the same way as the Arabic person. The Arabic person does math the same way as the French person, right? Okay. Now, in terms of other philosophers that we have read so far, here's how Augustine fits in with them. Roughly speaking, we've got one team of philosophers. If they all walked into a bar together, they'd find themselves to be good friends pretty quickly. And that's Plato, Descartes, and Augustine. Okay? Plato was a big influence on Augustine, and Augustine was a big influence on Descartes. Since this is an intro class, we don't need to get into all the details. But, especially for those of you who really like this class, keep your eyes open, keep your eyes peeled, and look for things that you think are relationships between what Descartes has done in our class and what Plato has done in our class. Now, partly that's just interesting. It's sort of like when you're listening to a band and you're like, oh, I get it. This band must be influenced by Led Zeppelin. Or you're like, oh, okay, I hear this guy rapping. His beats are very much, like 90s Dr. Dre or whatever. Partly that's just sort of interesting. But also for philosophy, it can help you understand the thinker better. Not every philosopher is connected to or resembles every other philosopher. So there's no whole lot of connection between Augustine and Nietzsche, for instance. But when there are those connections, as there are between Plato, Descartes, and Augustine, then it's almost like you learn twice as fast. Not because they repeat the same exact points, but you already know how some of the ideas fit together, so you fit them together faster and more tightly because you're building on your own knowledge. Okay, so Augustine, Descartes, and Plato basically form a team. They disagree on some points. They have different writing styles, different goals, right? They are different. But on many points, there will be a similarity of style, agreed upon facts, and so they work together. Now, here's the other thing. Part of why we're reading Augustine is because he so sharply disagrees with the other three authors we're doing. Beauvoir, Hume, who we're reading later, and Nietzsche are all a lot more skeptical that we can find truths that all of us can agree upon. Right? Especially for Nietzsche and for Hume, they're going to scoff at some of the things that St. Augustine says. Now, don't feel bad for St. Augustine. He has arguments to protect himself. He has reasons for believing what he believes. And he's going to scoff right back at them. So part of why we're reading Augustine is to raise this really interesting question, which has plagued philosophy from the start and plagues human life. How much is what you think and know actually the same as what other people think and know? In practical terms, this can help us figure out why we disagree about things, which disagreements are resolvable, fixable disagreements, and which things we just have to say, hey, we'll never agree on that in particular. Okay, so Augustine is going to talk about which things are totally true, always true, and in theory and in practice, completely agreeable. Sorry, not completely agreeable. Things which can be completely agreed upon by all people. It's not everything, but there's certain things, number and math, of course, are going to be the prime example, that as long as you put any effort into thinking about it, you'll come to the same answer and conclusion as everyone else. So Augustine's claim is that there are some capital T truths in the world which we can all latch onto and agree upon. There are some things which you'll never find capital T truth about, but here's the kicker. When you discover these capital T truths, the things upon which we can all agree, then you have a sort of yardstick or ruler, a reliable measure for all these other things that are harder to understand, harder to know if you've got the capital T truth about. Once more, we'll get to this in the second day of our reading. But the world's very confusing, but when you can count reliably, then even things which are confusing, like say the car wreck example, what happened, who's at fault, how fast were they going, you at least have something, number, which is reliable and a good measure, like a ruler or yardstick, for other things that are a little harder to understand. So basically, you have in your mental toolkit a few capital T truths about the world, and that lets you sort out the messiness of the world much more efficiently and effectively. Okay, so that's where Augustine stands sort of compared to the rest of the philosophers we're reading. Okay, we haven't gotten to Hume yet, but you'll see he's in some ways he's even more skeptical about truth than Nietzsche. In some ways, not quite as much, but you'll see. Okay. Another reason we're reading St. Augustine is this is a book about ethics. This is a book about good and evil, right and wrong. Once more, you'll be able to see the Christianity in what Augustine says, but also, once more, you'll see that some of the points he makes, that humans are better than and different from animals, are not really Christian points. They're just philosophical arguments that either are fully rational and true or are not fully rational and so not probably true. So this book, more than any other book we're reading, really gets to one of the key parts of philosophy. And you could take whole classes devoted to this. Ethics, right and wrong, good and evil. Now remember, I said before, a huge question in today's world is whether there are any capital T truths upon which we can all agree. And a lot of people today are totally skeptical. They don't believe that there's any capital T truth upon which we can all agree. Fine, I'm teaching some people who think that, so that's a legitimate position. But one of the real difficulties with that position is that if you don't think there's anything we can agree upon, right? That even science, for instance, is bias and opinion and always changing its mind, etc. Then how the heck are we going to live together? You know what I mean? If there's no capital T truth, then there's no capital T truth about right and wrong, morality, how people should treat each other. Well, if that's the case, oof, like that's That's a big, important issue. So Augustine is going to sketch out for this. He says, there are a few capital T truths, and some of them apply to what's right and wrong, how you should live your life. So what that means is, just like number gives you a reliable yardstick or ruler by which to measure other things, measure the truth of them, certain capital T truths about what a human being is are going to help us figure out how a human being should live. What is most valuable in your life, and which of those things are truly valuable for all human beings, no matter what, no matter if they're an ancient Greek, a Roman North African. So Augustine lived in North Africa under the the sway of the Roman Empire. A contemporary Frenchman, a contemporary Argentinian, a contemporary American, right? Some of those things about what's good and bad, what's valuable or good for a human life, are going to be the same for all of us. Okay. So I think that's enough context for now. And so we'll end this recording now, and then we'll jump in right into Book 1, Chapter 1. Thank you, everyone.